everyday witches emerge from the shadows of secrecy. Broom closets are flinging open and witches are taking flight. Whether you are hiding in your cozy closet or flying with pride, stay for a spell as Witchcasting with Theodora Pendragon and her guests share magical moments, stir the cauldron, and debunk misinformation and misconceptions about paganism, witches, and our wonderful world of magic.
Here we are for another episode of Witchcasting with Theodora Pendragon, and today my special guest is DivinatX, also known by L. Did I say that right?
Yes, you did. That was great.
Okay. What are we going to talk about today? Because you have a few things to offer. But what caught my attention is that you do readings at storefronts in high-profile events in Los Angeles.
Yes, so actually that's kind of in my past. That is part of my background as an intuitive reader. But at this point in time, especially post-pandemic, I have boiled it down to more special events where I work. Usually I have like one or two in-person events per month, but I basically started, people might chuckle at this, but I basically started as an intuitive reader, both online, kind of like in the heyday of Etsy. So that's where I like very, very first got my start. And then following that, when I started to get booked for in-person gigs, I started to do a lot of intuitive readings, card readings at goth clubs and nightclubs in Los Angeles. I've also done several karaoke nights, believe it or not, just because I was friends with the people putting them on. So yeah, I worked as a reader at nightclubs starting in 2014, I believe. I was at a storefront called the Crystal Matrix for a little while. I think it has since, like, just as of very recently closed down. Yeah, I've done all number of special events. I've done some high profile Hollywood type events and like private parties and things like that. So, yeah.
Tell us what your intuitive readings are about.
My focus is using cards. So at first I used tarot decks or tarot, however you prefer to pronounce it. I'm used to pronouncing it tarot. And then probably sometime in 2018 or 19, I taught myself how to do readings simply using playing cards because I wanted a little more of a way to be able to stand out from other readers. Los Angeles is a city that's very saturated with creative and metaphysical people of all kinds. So I wanted a way to stand out a little bit more, and I decided to focus on using playing cards to read. For those who don't know, playing cards are one traditional modality used by Romani people to do readings in a lot of places. I know playing cards are also used in African diaspora for divination. I taught myself. I became aware that these were cultural practices and people were not wanting to just like teach some random person who emailed them about wanting to learn this way. And I understood that. So I just kind of started working with the playing cards myself and seeing what came up. And I just kind of went from there.
Those who understand the tarot cards, can you explain how the regular playing cards correlate with the tarot cards?
Yes. So the suits have similar correspondences. As you know, playing cards also have court cards, right? There's a king, queen, and jack. My decks also have jokers. But it's funny because when I read, I tend to simply consider when a joker comes up like it's a card of free will, like it actually is the wild card, as if you were playing a game of cards. And I tend to read it that way. But so it has the court card correspondences, and then with the suits, typically hearts correlates to cups, diamonds correlates to pentacles, or sometimes it's called coins. Spades correlates to swords, and clubs correlates to staffs or clubs.
Or wands, right?
Wands, yes.
My cards have wands.
Right. Yeah. I don't know why I couldn't remember that from the regular tarot. Like, I've had a lot of decks where wands were called something else. So they were called staffs or staves in a lot of cases. Or it would be deck with kind of like an alternative approach that had sometimes like completely different suits. So I think it's interesting to play with that imagery too.
You said that you did readings in clubs. What was that like?
It's an interesting kind of a real-time battleground. There's all sorts of factors you have to negotiate. A lot of it was a really strong lesson in self-advocacy and asking for what I needed as well, because often it was necessary for me to request like a slightly more isolated area of the venue to have it be a little bit quieter. Sometimes I would be placed in a little bit out of the way nook. So I would have to like get really honed in on advertising somewhere else in the venue so that people knew to seek me out. And then eventually, when vendors, like people doing vending, became more common at some of the clubs and events here, I was usually just placed in their area, and it ended up being a more dedicated space that was slightly quieter. So I had to advocate for myself a lot. I certainly had to deal with a lot of intoxicated people, and I had to ask for people to respect my boundaries, not knock over my sign. I've had to ask people not to spill their drinks or burn cigarette holes in my tablecloth. Like I said, it's a great lesson in establishing assertive boundaries and advocating for yourself.
Doing readings in a nightclub isn't typical, is it? Maybe in Los Angeles?
I don't know. Yeah, out here certainly there's a big culture of metaphysical stuff and a witchy community and everything like that. So often when I've gone out to goth clubs, alternative nightclubs, I've seen people like that. To some degree, I know that I don't want to claim that I was like the first of anybody to try to do it or anything like that, but I know that I was in a position of, I will just be honest about it, like needing some extra income at the changeover between roughly 2010 and 2011. And I just did outreach to the club promoter and DJ, and I said, "Hey, can I do this?" So I kind of just took the initiative there, but it is something that I started to see quite a bit more.
That's a brave step, though, just going to a nightclub and say, hey, can I have a little corner so I could do intuitive readings? What kind of response did you get?
So that brings up a great point, actually. It was about relationship building because I had been connected to this particular nightclub for years. I had been a patron, I had been supportive, I had promoted their nights. With the karaoke folks that I mentioned, these were people who were my friends through karaoke events that I had attended and supported, through energy that I had already put into community. It wasn't like I just necessarily showed up off the street and asked for what I wanted. There can be upsides and downsides to how some of this operates. but in particular in LA, especially if you are in a smaller subculture or kind of an underground subculture, it's necessary for you to put some time in with the community before you are reciprocally given opportunities in a lot of cases. It wasn't like I just kind of like waltzed in and started asking for things. Now, I know that there are some people who do that. And I know that there are some people who just kind of like roll in from out of town in various scenes and subcultures here in LA and start to do some stuff like that. And I will say honestly, they're kind of put in check because I do think that people track your relationship to community and community presence and reciprocity in that regard. So I had established a decent amount and built the relationships before I made the request.
And you probably had credibility where these newcomers come in. They don't have credibility yet. They haven't proven themselves.
Maybe to some degree. I always struggle with like an externalized conception of how I'm perceived by others. So I honestly just don't want to assume either way. We can assume that, or we can not assume that and just assume that I asked the question and the answer was yes at the time. I don't want to necessarily assume on the credibility part, but who knows, right?
You said that your area is saturated with intuitive readers. Now, I'm in Texas, and the readers we have in my area, which is the San Antonio area, we all know each other. And if we don't know each other, we know someone else who knows them. So they're a big fish in a little pond. You're giving me the impression that there are a school of fish everywhere in Los Angeles doing intuitive readings.
As I mentioned, I really kind of got started taking my work with that to the public in the very late 2000s. So it was the advent of social media, it was the advent of mixing our skill sets and our presence with like being online all the time. I would say that at the time, the pool of people was maybe a little bit smaller, but what a lot of people from outside the area grasp is just like the Los Angeles area is a really huge, sprawling metropolis. It's a really big space. So, what I would describe it as, especially as far as like a witchy type community, is a large, small community. I know that sounds like a paradox that doesn't make sense, but it's a large, small community. Like that is to say that you will start to run into people multiple times, especially if you have a more like niche kind of approach or niche interest within that community, or you're more inclined towards paganism, or you're more inclined towards mystery schools, or you're more inclined towards new age, maybe. I'm just giving different examples. But so there's a lot, but eventually you'll start to run into people multiple times. I guess that it's a weird paradox to try to explain to people. And then now, at this point in time, especially I would say like post 2015 or 16, with the advent of TikTok, Witch Talk, Witches of Instagram, and all of that, there are people whose businesses are heavily based in their online presence who like still physically do things in the area where I live, but they also have this hugely expansive presence on the internet.
Earlier, you mentioned that you had an online presence with Etsy. Now, when I think of Etsy, where I shop a lot, if I buy any woo-woo stuff, it is altar tools and witchy supplies. I really wasn't aware that there were intuitive readings on Etsy. Is that what you did?
Yes. What I would do is I had a shop. I listed the deck that would be used for the reading. People had, various price points and various numbers of cards in a reading that would be used. They would select the one that they wanted and check out and pay. And then I would basically do a typed up email reading, because this was sort of before the area of like everybody FaceTimed, everybody was on a video call. So I would take a high quality photo of the layout of cards, and then I would do a really, really thorough typed up reading.
That must have been time consuming.
It was ultimately quite a bit energy consuming. And eventually, as I had done with some of the storefront readings and things like that, I scaled back on that work. It's not just the time, but it's like the energy sink into work like that is substantial, and it's something that needs to be acknowledged. And it also wasn't always necessarily like proportionate to the pricing I was charging at the time either. So I found that I could get compensated a little more fairly for my energy use in other ways. And I kind of moved away from that after a while.
I was aware that people do sell spells, and that was brought to my attention in a Facebook group that was for Etsy sellers. And somebody was complaining that it was a seller who sold a love spell to somebody. And I guess the love spell didn't work and the person wanted their money back. What are your thoughts on that?
My personal approach to that topic is I've never, as far as commerce, sold anything to that effect. But if I were ever going to do anything to that effect, it would be like more like a step by step toolkit to constructing a working that is in alignment with what you want. Because while I do understand that it's part of a lot of cultural and folk traditions to have an external practitioner who specializes in this stuff, and I fully and totally respect that, sometimes I think that folks are not as aligned with their own intentions or objectives. And to kind of have access to something that's like a little bit of a one size fits all solution where you are doing like where a practitioner is performing a working for another individual, like for a client. I think it can have mixed results a lot of the time, because a lot of clients aren't clear on their intentions, and aren't clear on exactly what they're trying to affect. And sometimes, because I've been in this position just with readings too, like it can have negative blowback on the practitioner. So I know for my own boundaries, I wouldn't ever really feel comfortable selling a spell online or anything like that. But as I also mentioned before, it is part of a lot of cultures. It is part of a number of folk practices. It's authentic to the way that a lot of people work energy. And I don't have anything generally negative to say about it. I think it just kind of depends on the paradigm you're approaching it from. And as a practitioner myself, I personally wouldn't feel interested in doing something like that. And that's just me. That's my boundary that nobody else has to have. That's just my take.
Let's go back to the beginning of your time. How did you get involved in all this? Was this in your family or this something that you sought out?
That's a great question. So, as far as spirituality and religion, I was raised interfaith. My dad is Jewish, and my mom is Eastern Orthodox Christian. I noticed that sometimes people call it Greek Orthodox. That is a little more culturally specific. I tend to use the umbrella term Eastern Orthodox. her church was in what is called an Antiochian church. It's just kind of pan-cultural. So I was raised with being taken to services of both until I was roughly, I think, 13 or 14, when I decided that I wanted to opt out of all of that. I did not receive confirmation in the Jewish faith. I don't know the gender neutral term for it. I've heard it generically called B'nai mitzvah, but bar or bat mitzvah. I didn't come to the age where I opted to receive confirmation in the Jewish faith, because that was the time at which I decided I was going to make another choice. And I just kind of moved away from that. But I feel like growing up with already multiple spiritual practices kind of laid the groundwork for just wanting to investigate different spiritual traditions and explore a lot. I'm also only realizing now, like in towards middle-aged adulthood, that even like my experiences of the Eastern Orthodox Christian faith are not as parallel to like some of the mainline Christianity experiences that are mainstream in the US. It was very different. You know, the congregation was very ethnic. It was largely immigrants from the Swana, aka the Middle East, Southwest Asia, North Africa, the Balkans, areas like Greece, or kind of former Soviet areas. So I grew up around this very thriving immigrant community that was also connected to this like faith group. It's only as I'm getting older that I'm like realizing all of the influence that this had on me, but also just how different it is from a lot of the mainline Christian experiences that people I've encountered grew up with.
This is a really good foundation that you had, because you had two parents of two different faiths who obviously respected that they had their own path.
Yeah, it's worth saying, like, they split up when I was about 6. What I will tell you is this. My mom was always vaguely told by my maternal grandma that she did have some Jewish heritage. So she was always vaguely aware of it, but she didn't get in touch with the Jewish side of her family until the mid 2000s. So basically, like after I'd gone off to college. So I feel like she always had a sense that she was connected to Jewishness also in some way, even though she's religion wise Christian in a really strong way. Because after my dad, she also like kept dating Jewish men. And my stepfather, who she got together with in the mid 2000s, is also Jewish. So I feel like it's in your DNA. Like, I guess sometimes you just go towards the thing that feels natural or something. Because she really only connected with that part of her ethnicity a little bit later in both of our lives. But it was just so fascinating to witness kind of like how she followed that thread.
It's probably in her astrological birth chart, but that's another topic. But let's go back to you and how you found your path. This is very interesting, though, about your parents, because that's how you started.
Right. Yeah. So probably at roughly 12 or 13, I read Laurie Cabot's book, The Power of the Witch. Probably around that time, I was like poking around at, Barnes and Noble, like a local corporate chain bookstore, and found The Power of the Witch. And I started reading it. And she had like all of the psychic visualization exercises and stuff like that. So, yeah, from about 12 or 13, I started dabbling in looking into some kind of like witchcraft derived practice. Following that, I would say there was a period of time between like my later teens and early 20s when I didn't really practice anything in particular. Probably slightly farther into my earlier 20s, once I had graduated undergrad college, I started kind of like exploring around with different spiritual traditions again. And I got to doing some reading about certain mystery traditions, stuff like the Golden Dawn and the OTO. I finally got to doing some more reading about Kabbalah or Kabbalah, however you pronounce it. And that was my first exposure to that. And that's something that became pretty significant to my practice. And I started getting more connected with the neo-pagan community. So probably between roughly 2006 and 2014 or 15, so almost a decade, I would have filed myself under the pagan, neo-pagan rubric. About 2014-ish or so, I started delving more into Kabbalistically derived, so Kabbalah or Kabbalah, Kabbalistically derived practice that was largely Gnostically informed. And my main teacher had gone through like a Gnostic informed mystery school. So it's interesting because, you know, I carry Jewish DNA, like Jewish ethno religion, and that is a part of me. And I was raised with the practices, but I ended up having this teacher who, to my understanding, is a non-Jew, but who went through a lot of mystery school training and was teaching this class. And I felt like I got quite a bit out of it at that point. So this, you know, I started that work in 2013 and I continued on from there and kind of worked through a lot of the energy of the Etz Chaim, otherwise known as the Tree of Life, for multiple cycles in a kind of very focused way. Now I would say that I ended up at a point that's like vaguely witchy, more so, you know, I would still describe myself as a Kabbalist or a Kabbalistic practitioner because that is a part of my DNA, and somewhat agnostic. So I kind of broke my connection with identifying as a pagan specifically sometime in like 2014 probably. And that is because I became increasingly uncomfortable with what I saw going on in that community. I respect my friends of all beliefs, but I just arrived at a point where I decided that it wasn't for me.
Your foundation with your parents was very influential, but you also had teachers who taught you about paganism and witchcraft. Tell us how they influenced you.
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. I feel like I've been through just so many different phases of my life, kind of working with the influence of different instructors, and I feel like they were really guides. I sort of feel like the term mentor is a little bit overused and abused these days because I feel that mentoring needs to be like a mutually reciprocal relationship. And I feel like these days sometimes people just turn around and decide to call a very influential teacher a mentor. And I feel like the word has gotten a little bit watered down. But anyway, my studies with instructors have gone to a lot of really, really interesting places. So I started with a teacher who's gone by the name of Jenna Silverhair. And she was very connected to kind of a more neo-pagan lineage, but her training in the craft has roots in 1734, which is a pretty well-known coven here in Los Angeles, and I believe was Alexandrian. She was actually the first who emphasized, like, yeah, I can name my lineage with this work. This is where you come from. This is the information that I'm transmitting down to you. And here it is. So I learned about a lot of the basic concepts from her, and her housemate, who was also part of that same 1734 breakoff type of coven that existed at one time. Her particular emphasis that she was working on at the time was also what she liked to call pagan ethics. I really kind of consider them to just be like universal don't be an asshole ethics, but she did a really interesting job of contextualizing them within like working with the craft and how you use energy. Following my work with her, there was a point in time that, for no particularly like negative reason or anything like that, I felt that what I could learn or absorb from work with her had kind of reached its end point. At that time, and kind of simultaneously to this, I had also been attending workshops by Laura Tempest Zakroff. She's a pretty well-known writer in witchcraft, and she considers herself to emphasize a path that she has called modern traditional witchcraft. It's not necessarily about emphasizing any huge ties to Gardnerianism or Alexandrianism or anything like that, but I would consider it just a very pragmatic approach. And also because she's a movement artist and dancer, she always emphasized like embodiment in her work. So I studied dance with her for quite some time, as well as began to attend her workshops and read her writings on the craft when she started publishing books. So that was going on. And then probably late 2012, I met the person who would become my Kabbalah teacher, Ayama Natara. So Natara is based here in Los Angeles. She considers herself to have what she called at the time shamanic inspired path. Now we know that shamanic and shamanism is a culturally specific word, and we need to be careful about using it, but it can be translated to a concept like spirit working, let's say, which is cross-cultural. Spirit working is cross-cultural. And she can anchor in the traditions that she's been connected to as well. Like I said, it is a multicultural tradition and teachers that she can name. But I started work with her, and she was the one who had gone through the Gnostic influenced mystery school training and had begun teaching Kabbalah. And she specifically called it experiential Kabbalah. So our work with the Sephirot was to manifest and seep into our everyday life. And we were supposed to feel a connectedness with the work, with the energy of each of those pips or sephira within what we saw manifest in our lives. I started doing the work with her specifically in 2013. That had a really huge influence on me. It's honestly, I think, for better or worse, part of the reason that I ultimately distanced myself away from a lot of the pagan and esoteric community. Because for one, I started witnessing the extent to which many traditions felt entitled to help themselves to the lineage of Judaism, which is supposed to be a closed practice. Like, technically, you are supposed to go through a conversion process if you're going to use those elements. So definitely within that period of a lot of the mystery schools being built, which I know a lot of it happened in like the 1800s, early 1900s, there was a lot of appropriation. There was a lot of slapping motifs from different cultures and lineages together, for better or worse. Like, that's not to claim that nothing ever benefited anybody, but I think it's important to be critical of where some of these practices might have issues.
Is there something you can tell the listeners if they're still trying to find their path? What advice would you give them? Because there are so many options, and quite a few people have a religion of origin that they're trying to break away from. What advice would you give them?
That's a really interesting and provocative question. I would say start by really getting to know yourself as a human. And that can be a difficult process. One of the more beneficial things that some schools, like, I think if I'm remembering correctly, Order of the Golden Dawn, advocated was actually like going through psychotherapy because of the level of self knowledge and self exploration that facilitated. It's hard to give one size fits all advice on how to find yourself or how to know yourself. Some global South and indigenous cultures have a ritual of communing with plant medicine to make that happen. But unfortunately, in global North culture, we've decontextualized that to the point where that can get dicey if you do not have the appropriate spiritual leadership within a situation like that also. So basically, I would say start reaching for the things that you feel like affirm you, that make you feel good, that make you feel like your fullest, most authentic self in the moment. Start with that and see where that begins to take you. Because your answer might not look like somebody else's answer. A teacher is a very valuable thing to have, but they can only teach you so much abstract information. It's important to just fully live life to see where you are drawn as a person and how you are realizing yourself as a human.
Absolutely. The key word is authenticity. Where do you feel at home?
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you for being my guest.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you, Theodora. This has been so great.
It has, and you're my first person from Los Angeles.
Oh, wow.
You'll make all the witches want to live in Los Angeles.
It's such an interesting feeling to be here because there is a really high level of open-mindedness, but also to the extent of like, part of what I was trying to address earlier too is like, we can safely here live in bubbles where we're not just like living in some justification of trying to exist. Like, I kind of have lived in like subculturally isolated circles where I don't have to worry about who I am, or I don't have to necessarily worry about my safety a great amount of the time, where people kind of default like are working to be inclusive. And I totally know that that exists elsewhere. I'm absolutely aware. I'm not one of those people who thinks that the South or the Southwest is toothless and backwards. I know that's a really negative belief system that happens on the coasts, and I don't agree with it because I've met some really, really, really great people from the middle of this country as well. But there is kind of like this cultural ability to just exist in more of a bubble of safety here, whether you be a witchy inclined person, whether you be LGBTQ plus like me, whether you are in a subculture. it's kind of a unique position. So, yeah.
You're a very lucky person.
Yes. Oh, yes. No, absolutely. Like it is, that's what I was trying to say too. Like it's quite a privileged position and privileged place to be if you're somebody who's used to belonging to a group that's existed more on the margins.
Well, thank you for joining me today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. This was fun.
It is fun.
Thank you for joining us for Witchcasting with Theodora Pendragon. Have a burning question or have a topic you'd love Theodora and her guests to discuss on the show? Contact her through Instagram at Theodora Pendragon. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And help us spread the word by leaving us a rating and review and sharing it with your friends. See you next time, and may your magic always shine.